EU5 has introduced the value system, where every nation sits somewhere between plus 100 and minus 100 on certain topics, ranging from warfare to economy and to country organization. Some values are straight up better than others, some are situational, and for some you are actually best off sitting in the middle of the road. And that's what we're going to be covering today. As always, timestamps will be provided for you to skip around if you so wish. But before we get into the video proper, well, just a quick piss up to say that a like would be appreciated and a subscription would be amazing if you haven't already. The 100k sub goal remains a lofty ambition, but one I still do believe in. So let's go get it. Otherwise, if you are grabbing EU5 or anything else in the Paradox store, please do use code LemonCake, it does help support the channel. But that's surely enough self-shilling. Let's get into the game. And the first thing we're going to be talking about is centralization versus decentralization. Now, at maximum levels of centralization, the main thing that you'll be looking at is the minus 10% reduction in proximity cost and the crown power increase of 50%. For decentralization, its main quote-unquote selling point is the plus 20 base loyalty of subjects, as well as the 5 estate satisfaction equilibrium. Counter-espionage does conceptually exist, but much like in EU4, the truth of the matter is that if the AI or other people want to spy on you, you can't really prevent them doing that, right? You can make it more miserable for them, sure, but you can't stop them spying on you. So all you've really done is that if they would have taken 10 months to create a war goal on you, they've taken 12 months to create a war goal on you. This is, I guess, more noticeable in EU4 compared to EU5, but in EU5 it's less noticeable because no CBs are also more present. So counter-espionage may be a bit better, for example, preventing spy network modifiers, but in a large sense of the term, it's pretty irrelevant. So that doesn't matter. What does matter for centralization, it's one of the reasons that you pretty much always want to go centralization, is that early game there's not a lot of sources of crown power. Now, as you play the game, as you unlock more advances and more techs, as you can see here, yes, I have 50% from centralization, but also absolute rulership, is a tech for 50%. There's a bunch of techs that give like 10%, 20%, building the House of Parliament gives 20%, bolstering crown authority, getting favor of the rule of laws. There's so many sources of crown power eventually. And that kind of means that the 50% from centralization is less relevant when you have like plus 300% from other sources already, right? So that's something to bear in mind. But early game, when you don't have all those buffs, right, the centralization plus 50% crown power is actually quite important, and it's one of the few sources of getting crown power early. As you attempt to centralize and go towards the, dare I say, more absolutist mode of ruling your country, crown power from centralization is one of the few places you can actually squeeze it out early game. The other thing, of course, is proximity cost. Now, minus 10% proximity cost doesn't actually matter as much as you'd think it does, unless you're building around proximity cost. And when you're building around proximity cost, it really does start to matter. So, proximity cost there is mainly good for modifier stacking. And this does mean that in theory, if you're building around subjects, having more loyalty of subjects is kind of better. But my issue is that loyalty of subjects is a bit of a weird scaling modifier in the sense that if it was scaling with, let's say, subject development instead, then it would be better. But flat subject loyalty isn't that useful for a subject build, because in a subject build, your subjects tend to be loyal enough. You're very rarely constrained by subject loyalty as the limiting factor for having more vassals. The main one usually is diplomatic capacity, or again, individual subjects getting too big and things like that, right? Those are the usual restraining factors. A flat 20 loyalty on everything doesn't prevent, for example, if you start annexing your subjects, them getting annoyed at you because you've annexed like 20 subjects previously, right? The other one that kind of matters here is the estate satisfaction equilibrium. Plus 5 is pretty nice to have. It's certainly not a bad bonus. And in practice, what plus 5 estate satisfaction equilibrium actually means is you can just tax your estates 5% more. And that's good. So estate satisfaction equilibrium giving you more taxes, that's good. There's no denying that. My issue is that come late game, having more proximity costs means that you will make more money from taxation because you have more control over areas than you will from squeezing out an extra 5% as you start to regress from a palace economy. I think regress is the wrong term, but as you start to move away from a palace economy and you start to spread out your sources of income across a larger area, you're better off having more, well, you're better off having more centralization to actually have the control proximity sources for your land. Where decentralization is really going to do very well in is basically in OPMs of very small nations that don't need the proximity cost. They will struggle with the lack of crown power, that's fair, but they don't need necessarily the proximity cost that centralization provides, and come late game, they'll be able to get away without the lack of crown power from the other sources of crown power they can get. Another thing that's kind of important to realize when it comes to the crown power debate versus estate satisfaction equilibrium debate is that if you just give a privilege to each one of your estates that gives the loyalty plus 5%, right? So I give them control of the monetary policy, that's going to increase their burger power here, right? But what that also is going to do is, apart from some other modifiers, is of course going to decrease your relative crown power because the burghers are more powerful, right? In essence, meaning that centralization can actually be better for estate loyalty because by having more crown power, you can give out more privileges and still not go below the 25% threshold. So in practice, you just want to be centralized the vast majority of the time. But in the early game, as you move towards centralization, a couple of things are going to happen, basically. First of all, as you move away from decentralization, your loyalty of subjects will drop and your state satisfaction equilibrium will drop, meaning that as you move away from decentralization, you're going to be hurt by those modifiers going away. Remember, sitting at 50 decentralization or 100 decentralization doesn't give you any crown power. It's just the positives get weaker. But once you start crossing into the centralization, start getting crown power and proximity cost, you'll see that it makes up for it, basically. But the actual movement away from decentralization can be somewhat painful, as you'll end up making less money as you go from 100 decentralization to, say, 50 decentralization. And your subject's going to be more dissolved if you have a lot of subjects, which in the early game, you tend to actually have, shall I say, more than average subjects. Assuming a conventional game, of course, there are going to be shenanigans that happen. So overall, there's no reason to sit in the middle. I think just full send centralization. It's one of the things that I would recommend for the vast majority of campaigns. And in general, if you are actually going to be using decentralization, it's for a very, very specific build. And in that case, you are already decided on a build and you don't need this video. So centralization is going to be my recommendation for the first value. Next, to talk about traditional versus innovative. With traditional, you gain some estate satisfaction equilibrium. Your embrace institution cost goes through the roof. This is absolutely terrible, but it's cheaper to invest into stability. And this stability investment is going to be relevant if you also go Unsinicized as one of the countries that has access to that mechanic, because you're able to get the stab investment cost down to like something stupid. You're basically going to be able to stab for free, and that can be nice. My question is that worth not going down innovative? And my answer to that is just no. Embrace institution cost being reduced by 50% is incredible because it also decreases the stab cost. The max literacy increase is absolutely amazing. In practice, that's plus 10% technology once all literacy is caught up. And literacy has a whole bunch of other side effects that are pretty nice to have on certain pops. The big one is that if you are struggling with pop promotion, and we take a look at something like the peasants over here, I actually don't have that many peasants, but these peasants, because of their literacy, are getting a pretty massive pop promotion speed. So a 10% literacy on peasants is 20% pop promotion speed. It's something that you need to comprehend. And that's a pretty nice modifier to have. In essence, sufficient levels of literacy do mean that you will not need to struggle with pop promotion and filling jobs from that domain. So that's something to bear in mind. That said, there's also the case of innovative giving you cultural influence or offensive culture versus traditional giving you cultural tradition. I think traditionalism for cultural tradition can be a build where either you're in China, you're trying to stab investment cost down to like 0, in which case fair enough, you'll go traditional, or you're trying to get a lot of cultural tradition to get defensive sieging, because that's basically the only thing that cultural tradition actually does beyond being defensive culture. So within those domains, yes, cultural tradition matters. But if you're not doing some obscure, like, fort maxing build, and you're not doing some, like, Chinese hyper-stable orbit state, because you can't be China, you have to be one of the sinicized or potentially sinicized countries that unsinicizes itself, you should just go innovative basically every time. I wouldn't say that innovative necessarily needs to be nerfed, although I'd be fine if they nerfed innovative. I think tradition just needs a buff. Much like decentralization, in my opinion, also does need a buff. But yes, on this scale, it's a pretty easy win for innovativeness, in my opinion, as well. With that said, we move on to spiritualism versus humanism. At maximum level of spiritualism, you get 20 more clerics in towns and cities, which are quite nice. Cleric pops are good. Your pop conversion speed goes up, your pop assimilation speed goes down. Antagonism, religious influence is a bit more whatever. Either you're dealing with antagonism or you're not. I know, stupid as it sounds, but very rarely do I actually notice the antagonism, religious influence percentage modifier. The big part from the spiritual modifier list is the tolerance of true faith +2. That is good. For those unaware, tolerance of the true faith or tolerance of any religion gives you +5 or -5 satisfaction, pop satisfaction that is, depending on, well, its negative or positive effect. And as such, positive tolerance of the true faith basically makes every single person that follows your religion 10% happier. And that's pretty strong. The other option is Humanist, which gives you tolerance to the heretic and heathen belief, and one I've gone in here because I'm tech maxing. There's a innovative humanist government reform, exchange of ideas, there it is for 5% research progress growth, nice, right? But that needs 50-50 of 50 humanist, 50 innovative, so that's why I decided to go full send humanism here. The thing that I think we're going to have to mention is that there are a lot of techs that give you conversion speed, right? Like, you can frankly get some stupid modifiers for conversion speed. And bear in mind, I haven't gone over the top. There are more texts and things I could have done for conversion speed, but I am getting like 55% from technologies and laws, cathedral, average literacy of clerics. There's a lot of sources of missionary strength, and then you also get base missionary strength from certain texts, like missionary schools and confectionism, giving you plus 10, for example, right? That's a base monthly conversion rate. And that means that even if you're fully humanist, you can still kind of one-faith it. It's not really a tolerance thing. If you take a look at my religion, I've one-faced Lolody despite not really having to convert that much, because the passive conversion rate is just enough in all of these locations, right? And that's with me being humanist. And so one of the things that you're going to notice with humanism is that it's more than possible to one-faith or at least convert a lot with humanist still, but spiritualists pop assimilation reduction is a bit more noticeable. It's a bit harder to. There are a lot less cultural assimilation differences, meaning that being super spiritual is actually quite bad for a blobbing campaign. And this is where the big divides are going to be. I think if you are blobbing or trying to do a world conquest or something like that nature, you kind of need the tolerance of heretics and heathen beliefs, and you appreciate the assimilation speed to be able to core places, right? So for that reason, go humanist, be happy. If you're tall, though, or playing without much conquest in a constrained land, basically where the conversion speed is not going to be that much of an issue, right? So in my case, I'm playing Scotland here. I'm not going to run into cultural conversion issues. Ironically, Spiritualists would have been better. The reason is Tolerance of the True Faith +2 is plus 10 pop satisfaction that you can kind of pick up for free. Possible clerics in towns and cities does start to add up because this is affected by the modifiers. It's base possible clerics in towns and cities. So you just get a lot more pops to grow your own consumer economy. And look, clerics don't consume that much, but they consume more than peasants, so it's a good thing to have. And overall, I'd recommend within tour campaigns to go fully spiritual. However, if you're expanding, if you're blobbing, if you're coring a lot, I think Humanist is pretty hard to pass up on. So this one is going to be the first It Depends. Tour campaign, go Spiritualist. Wide campaign, go Humanist. With that said, that we move on to Aristocracy versus Plutocracy. This has been changed recently as well, but Aristocracy still gives +5 discipline, increases your cost of court by 2, that part sucks. Nobility power is +50, not 100%, and you get 10 more nobles in towns and cities. Neat. Plutocracy, meanwhile, gives you 100 burghers in towns and cities, and that's a lot. Increases burgher power by 50%, decreases cost of court, and gives you some trade efficiency. That trade efficiency is actually pretty nice. Don't underrate that 2.5% trade efficiency. The way that trade efficiency works, and if any of you are still under the impression that EU5 doesn't have a lot of money sinks and money faucets, trade efficiency is one of the money faucets. If I were to, for example, import, let's take a look at markets actually. If I have, I'm not sure if I've banned from the London market, but to give an egregious example of, let's say, alum, right? What's alum being priced at? 3.3 ducats, and alum is being priced at 1.98 ducats. So if I export alum from the Edinburgh market to London, I will make a marginal price difference of give or take around a ducat. It's a bit more than that, but let's put in transportation costs and all those things, right? I'll make a ducat selling alum from Edinburgh to London. So instead of making 1 ducat of profit, because I have 2.5% trade efficiency, I will make 1.025 ducats of profit. In essence, it is the free money that appears from trade profits. Is that abusable? Yes. In fact, there might be a video I make. I'm not sure if they'll fix it or not. In essence, it involves setting up a tringle of markets where you ship around the exact same trade good that's very highly priced, and you farm money from the trade efficiency modifiers you can pick up from things like Plutocracy. Very profitable, huge free money thing. But outside of obvious exploits and abuses of the game mechanic, that's what trade efficiency does. And that's going to be pretty strong, especially if you get a decent chunk of it and you are a very big trade empire. For me, though, the reality of the situation is that +5 discipline is just too strong of a modifier to pass up on. Expected cost of court does also hurt, but you can tank it, and the possible nobles in town and cities are a much better source of economy than the 100 burghers in towns and cities and the expected cost of court income. Autocracy is a great way of making money. Sorry, aristocracy, not autocracy, my apologies. Simply because having more nobles in your towns and cities is a great way of increasing your own consumer demands, because nobles demand a lot of good trade goods and a lot of valuable trade goods. So that part is really good. I do want to say that there do exist some trade builds where you want to go down plutocracy. But even then, within those trade builds, because you already have a bunch of other trade efficiency, the trade efficiency increase from plutocracy isn't that noticeable. And if anything, you're probably best off going aristocracy anyway, just for those postable nobles in towns and cities. And honestly, the discipline's just good. Like, it's very hard to point to a part, like, as painful as it sounds, but even in a super big trade build, you're basically better off not taking the extra trade efficiency here and getting the increase in your own consumer demands and just having the discipline for having better troops to be able to protect your own trade routes, right? I am sorry to say this, but I think aristocracy is just consistently better, at least at the moment, before any further rebalancing. But as always, feel free to disagree. I'm going to say that anyway, because you're going to disagree with me whether I give you permission or not, shall we say. So, how unaristocratic of me. I'm permitting disagreements. Anyway, next we have serfdom versus free subjects. This got changed recently. Laborers were not considered peasants and were not previously affected by the food consumption changes of serfdom versus free subjects. This very much matters because if I look at my demographics, my country is 60% labor. This is what working in RGOs look like, but yep, well, there you go. So that's kind of a big thing to impact. Basically, the peasant and laborer classes were separate for the purpose of food consumption, but the same for the estate, which was a bit weird. And I'm going to go out on a bit of a weird limb here. I've gone free subjects in this campaign specifically because I'm LARPing as a free subject country, but you shouldn't. Unfortunately, serfdom is just better. Maximum tax for peasants estate, if you look at my economy, I could really use that. I mean, I've hit money cap, so I've kind of stopped taxing, as you may imagine, right? But, like, I could really appreciate some extra tax base here, or max tax for commoners. It's a pretty good thing to have. A lot of commoners are a good thing to tax, not because each individual commoner's rich, right? But the thing to bear in mind is that most of your country usually tends to be commoners, like well over 90-95%. So being able to tax like the largest part of your tax base, pretty good thing to do. And commoners also responsible for a lot of the RGO and like good RGO outputs. So, for example, selling iron, selling gold, selling silver, all those precious metal industries, all those things fall under the peasant estate for the purposes of taxation. So, being able to tax those things is just better. This is then combined with raw material output being increased by 10% and supply limit being higher. The supply limit's a bit whatever, but I guess it's nice. The raw material output is just good. There aren't that many raw material output bonuses in the game, so having one like this is pretty neat. Free subjects, on the other hand, don't even make your peasants happier for having more free subjects. Your pop promotion speed goes up, which is nice, but if you want your pop promotion speed to go up, just build libraries and get your literacy up. You don't need the pop promotion speed from here. Your max tax from peasants actually decreases, which can be a bad thing. And the problem with peasant food consumption, labor food consumption going down, is that it is actually a strong modifier. And you'd think that's pretty good. And the thing is, as well, is that you can really stack peasant pop food consumption to the point where eventually, for example, within nobility, there's I believe I've already granted the privilege, but there's one that decreases peasant food pop consumption by 10%. Nobility controlled serfdom. Give me a second, I'll find the thing. I think it's this one. There we go. Nobility controlled serfdom. Peasants and laborers' food consumption decreases by 10% again. Meaning, first of all, is that when you take a look at the serfdom and this increase, you can actually give it nobility controlled serfdom and completely offset this modifier. But it also means that you can still grant nobility controlled serfdom and go free subjects, which really decreases the amount of food consumption you're getting. In the same way that 80 to 90% of your pops are peasants and hence are subject to peasant taxes, 80 to 90% of your food consumption is also peasants. And yes, of course, nobility and clergy consume more food, but compared to the total amount of food consumption in your per market or per country level, the vast majority is actually done by peasants and laborers. So this is the most noticeable impact. That said, though, food production is usually quite scalable. Even here in Edinburgh, in the Edinburgh market and in Scotland, I was able to grow a sufficient amount of food. If we take a look here, my food slider's on 0 because I'm usually exporting food. And that's, me making enough food. But I'm just saying, this isn't exactly known as a bread basket or anything. The Edinburgh market isn't one that usually has a food surplus, and yet I'm still able to export food. So it's certainly doable, especially as more and more technologies and more buffs arrive to give you food output bonuses, right? So if you take a look at, for example, this province here, I'm making an absolutely ridiculous amount of food because of food productivity buffs, farming villages, people being employed in them. I actually haven't upgraded the things, right? Like I could build more farming villages and not all of them are being worked because I have a crippling labor shortage here in Scotland. But you get the point, right? I have 6 more wheat RGOs that I'm missing, right? Of course I have enough food, but my point being is that even as you go capital economy, there's just so many techs and so many bonuses you can pick up that you can just have enough food. And I don't think a food economy is a good thing to have from an export basis, but it's certainly a good thing to have from a feeding your own population basis. So I do basically see the argument for the peasant food consumption, labor food consumption, but it's something that I'd rather outscale and use the benefits of serfdom. So, between the serfdom and free subjects, I'm going to suggest serfdom formally as my recommendation. With that said, though, we now move on to mercantilism and free trade. At maximum free trade, you pick up a 100 burger trade capacity, you pick up some more trade efficiency, you pick up 20% trade advantage. For those that don't know how trade advantage works, let's say I have 1 trade advantage and you have 2 trade advantage, and we're both trying to buy gold. The person that has more trade advantage, in this case you, is going to be able to buy that gold first, and if there's no more gold left in the market by the time I get to it with my lower trade advantage, I can't buy it. In essence, if there is 3 buy orders for gold, but only 1 gold in the market, assuming each buy order is for 1 unit of gold, the person with the highest trade advantage is able to grab those trades before they quote-unquote run out. So in essence, it's a good modifier to have, but the best way of securing trade advantage is owning the market. So conquest is the best way of acquiring trade advantage, let's put it this way. Mercantilism, meanwhile, decreases trade maintenance, that is the cost you have of maintaining your trades, decreases your trade efficiency, that is to say money you're making from trades, has a pretty big bonus to market protection. What market protection is in practice is the reason that England has basically gotten those northern provinces away from my market into their market. They have more market protections, meaning that their provinces get extra attraction towards market centers they own, so I don't have any quote-unquote market control over these areas, right? Basically, if you want people to stay inside your markets, you want market protection. And finally, you increase the export costs from markets for foreign traders. All right, whatever. It's literally for foreign traders. Oh no, the AI has to spend a bit more money, guys. It's so over. I can't believe it. We've crippled the enemy AI. They've had to spend more money on exporting from our market. How could that happen? Banned sarcasm aside, the honest answer to the situation is that free trade can be downright an issue if you're trying to do things like crash the price of construction materials. Because the way burger trade capacity works is that they just make the most profitable trades, right? So burgers will have trade capacity. For when you build a marketplace, burgers gain base trade capacity, and then there are certain things you can give to the burgers that give them more trade capacity, like free trade. And let's say that you're trying to crash the price of construction material in your market. Well, that price being very low means that the burgers are going to start exporting cheap construction material from your markets to other markets, in essence, reinflating your prices. Now, burger trade capacity can be a good thing if you are basically a production economy. If I have inside my own market, for example, let's take a look at Glasgow over here. I have some decent industries. I made a whole bunch of paper, right? Now I'm making a stupid amount of paper. I'm making 265 units of paper from Glasgow here. Obviously, there's not that much demand for paper inside of my own economy. There probably is, but I'm making more than 260. I'm making it not just in Glasgow, right? And I'm still able to make a decent profit from it because a lot of the paper has been exported out of this market and imported to others. And so burger trade capacity, even though it acts as an equalizer and can be a bad thing if you're trying to crash certain prices, it also acts as an equalizer if you're trying to maintain certain prices. So this allows you to hyper-industrialize and keep profitable industries around simply because you have more trade capacity, normalizing global prices, if that makes any sense. So it can be both a good and a bad thing depending on which part of the game and what you're trying to achieve. For me, though, mercantilism is good if your attempt to make money from trade is to conquer the trade. And free trade is better if your attempt of making money from trade is to be a nice, small, tall Netherlands Republic and trade with someone, for example, right? That said, though, the actual bonuses from either, like 2.5 trade efficiency, okay, but you lose some market protection, so France might start poaching some of your provinces, for example. And I guess a trade advantage can be nice, but in many cases, I'm sitting here and I'm going, do I care about that much free trade? Not really. And the same for mercantilism. You can usually get enough market protection, though, ironically enough, to defend your own, land. The trade maintenance can be nice. By the time you're able to save a lot of money from trade maintenance, you're doing so much trade, you've made a bunch of money. That said, though, the trade efficiency does still, it pains you, but a bit. This is a weird one. I think it's fine to go towards either direction, but it's also fine to sit in the middle for trade. You don't need either free trade or mercantilism to succeed in this game, to be clear. And the fact it pops up relatively later into the game when you've already kind of scaled means that if you want your cabinet to not spend effort pushing free trade or mercantilism, and you want to use them on something else, go for it. I think it's fine to sit in the middle. That said, though, as a formal recommendation for mercantilism, if you have a large empire where you own all the market centers, I think mercantilism is better. And if you have a large empire where you're trading with the world, but you're not actually owning the people you're trading with, then you want to go free trade. But with that, we move on to belligerence versus conciliatory. Paradox has a bit of a weird approach to modifier stacking. That's certainly a topic for another video, and I hope you stick around for that, so make sure you subscribe to not miss it. But the TLDR is, I think they wanted to give -10 war score cost in Belligerence, or even more war score cost in Belligerence, and to make up for that, they've basically nerfed Belligerence into the ground. But they've still realized that blobbers are going to take Belligerence -10 war score no matter what, so they've decreased the dip rep -4. That -4 dip rep really sucks. And they buffed Conciliatory to such a ridiculously stupid extent, with extra 10 efficiency of cabinet is huge, +4 dip rep is huge, even some more loyalty of subjects, to the point where, let's get something straight away in a way that we understand it. Corsa's belly creation speed does not matter, right? Oh no, I have to spend a couple extra months fabricating a claim. That's fine, right? That's okay. I can move around it. And one of the big reasons we can move around it is because the best CB in the game, Parliament CB, doesn't really have a fabrication time. You just go to Parliament, you say, "Hello, Parliament, please give me CB," and then they give it to you, and you're happy, right? So the Caster's Belly creation time in practice does not matter. Efficiency of cabinet, meanwhile, is a very strong modifier to stack. Dip rep is an excellent modifier to stack. And for Belligerence, you're losing dip rep. For -10 war score cost, I think it's still a must for Giga blobbing campaigns. But if your campaign goal is, let's say, some light blobbing, you wanna do Spain, and you play Castile, you wanna form Spain. You play France, you wanna get French natural borders. Yeah, you want to unite Germany, even if it's something like uniting Germany. I genuinely think you're still better off going conciliatory, because it just helps that efficiency of cabinet for dealing with integrating your land and being more efficient, and it also helps dealing with coalitions in that way as well. If you're doing some very modified stacking world conqueror rights, of course there's value in war score cost, but I want to genuinely say for 85% to 90% of all EU5 campaigns, and the statistic is, I've made the statistic up, of course, you're better off just going conciliatory. The efficiency of cabinet is just that good. And this is even post-nerfs, because efficiency of cabinet from conciliatory used to be like 20%. Just the dip rep is nice. It's good to have. Hey, even the loyalty of subjects is a little extra cherry on top. But if you very specifically need the war score cost, go for the war score cost. And with that, we move on to quality versus quantity. An age-old debate. The amount of people on the internet very bravely and proudly proclaiming that quantity has a quality of its own, and then seemingly forgetting the time that the Spanish defeated an entire empire with 200 guys, some horses, and a dream, is fascinating to me. What I think is important to understand is that on a purely numerical, dare I say, military science matter, I'm going to specifically not hover over the modifiers. If you have twice the troops that your opponent has, that's quite a big quality jump. Because in essence, one of their guys has to kill two of your guys, meaning he has to deal double the damage. And as long as you're dealing more than half the damage that he is dealing, the fact that you have two guys compared to one means you're going to be better off. Now, of course, there's a lot of things going on there. Combat widths within EU5, and even in the real-life examples, look, quality versus quantity doesn't really matter if we're fielding, for example, a World War II army with full supplies and a modern, logistical network against Roman spearmen, right? To give a pretty common, like, haha, can a World War I army defeat Rome? And then they go and say, but they actually can't resupply. Well, I'll tell you what, a modern army without resupply can't really defeat much of anything, so it's a pretty dishonest argument. But where it matters for us is that if your quality is so far lower, you're so far behind, let's say you're behind on 5 institutions, you have to have an on-par level of quality for quantity to matter. You have to be within the same league of quality for quantity to matter, right? And once your quality is in the same league, it doesn't have to be the best. Once it's at least, like, comparable, then quantity starts to really matter. And I think that's something that's important to understand, right? With that said, when it comes to the actual modifiers in the game at the moment, what does quality provide you with? Well, it increases your army maintenance by 10%, that sucks, but it makes your army morale recover a bit faster. I think army morale recovery rate is fine in this game, and I would not advocate for going down quality for the army morale recovery speed, but you pick up 10% military tactics, which is pretty good, or 0.1 in essence, meaning that you will take less damage, and you get 25% more army initiative. On the other hand, with quantity, you get a massive 25% frontage, you reduce your army maintenance by 10%, your units consume 10% less food, but you pick up 25% army initiative. Here's my problem with that. Let's take a look at, that's a bad general, because he's only got 24 dip. Okay, let's see. Do we have a high dip general? Sure, we've got this guy. What does 98 diplomatic ability give you? Gives you 98% goddamn army initiative. This is really, really broken and really, really powerful. In practice, meaning that it doesn't matter if you have minus 25 or plus 25 initiative. If you have enough diplomacy on your general, he's going to diplomatically reinforce faster and make everyone happy in the process with higher army morale. General stats matter to a stupid extent, to the point where basically having like a 99, 99, 99 general, like you look at this 85 and 86 here, you're getting almost plus 10 discipline. You're getting up 10 possible frontage, and you're getting siege ability, you're getting combat speed, all these great things that you're getting from your general stats, to the point where the actual decrease you get from quantity losing 25 army initiative isn't that relevant because you will just have enough troops to reinforce the battle, right? Consider Hearts of Iron 4, and I apologize for those that have played it, but radio gives you a pretty big boost in reinforcement chance, right? But let's say instead of giving you a 4% boost in reinforcement chance, which is what it gives unless I'm mistaken now, radio gave you 100%. And then there was another radio tech that gave you another 100%. At that point, it's not going to matter because you reinforce the battle enough. It's not a case of do you reinforce the time, it's in the case of do you have the troops to reinforce with. That becomes the matter for the army initiative and the army reinforcement modifiers. And that's the thing with army initiative, is that yes, minus 25 to minus 20 plus 25 seems like a big swing, but your generals give you plus 100. And then on top of that, there are so many techs that also give you reinforcement speed. To be clear, and I think I'll be able to find it. Yeah, there we go. First Strike gets 20% army initiative, just for everyone. And this is relatively early in the Age of Renaissance as well. And there are more as you play into the game later, giving you those army initiative extra reinforced speed modifiers. Like this is basically the chance of going, to be clear, I should probably clarify this earlier, it's the chance of going from reserves into the battle. And all of this basically coalesces in a way where the army initiative from quantity compared to the army initiative from quality genuinely doesn't matter. So you're left comparing is, do you want 0.1 more mill tactics, or do you want 25% more frontage? And of course, the army maintenance is better for quantity. Armies tend to be expensive things, but from a purely I want to win the fight battle, 25% frontage is absolutely massive and absolutely ridiculous, and you should be going down quantity practically every single time. Yes, with quality you'll be able to take less damage, so that's nice from the military tactics, but I am sorry. 25% more frontage means you can have 25% more troops in the battle. The enemy will have to deal 25% more damage every single tick, and it's going to have to, and you are allowed to deal less damage to still deal the same amount, if that makes sense, right? Because you have 25% more dudes dealing that damage. It is an absurd level modifier to the point of, like, who balanced this? And the thing that you have to bear in mind is that obviously if you both are not filling to frontage, let's say it's a fight between 10k and 10k, and the frontage allows for 20,000 on each side, obviously this is going to do nothing. But within those prolonged fights where you have enough troops to fill frontage, and if I, playing as Scotland, can have 100k levies and 220k men in the field, you have no excuse to not be able to fill frontage here, right? And at this point, bear in mind, my frontage is still 12, give or take. Like, I still have 6k in reserves in these battles and getting 30k per row, and I could certainly use more of my manpower to basically double these armies. I'll probably increase them by 50% because obviously I'll take attrition, so I'll be aware. But still, right? It is absolutely possible to wield armies that take up all of frontage within conventional play of the game, and hence having more frontage is good. So I'm very sorry to say, and I will still need to do more testing for a more comprehensive understanding of the EU5 military, but at the moment, quantity is just better. And so that's going to be my formal recommendation for the quality versus quantity debate. With that, though, we move on to offensive versus defensive. Offensive providing you with siege ability, decreasing your fort defense by a massive 50%, and giving you some extra assault ability. Defensive, on the other hand, gives you more fort defense, makes your troops move a bit slower, which does suck. Do you know how you can offset minus 10 army movement speed? Get like 20%. I think it's 20% army movement speed from like 100 mil stats. Let me double check. Yeah, I mean, basically, you can offset the army movement speed absolutely fine, right? From your general stats. Those are so important. And so, in general, minus 10 army movement speed can be a bit annoying, but it's fine. The big part is you get 50% more fort limit, you get 20% minus fort maintenance, and you get more combat speed and fort defense. Because of the current balancing of the game, once you get regulars, the way you win sieges is by assaulting everything. And before you get regulars, you have to actually siege, because assaulting with levies is a disband levies button, but you actually don't want them to come home to the fields. Once you have regular troops, assaults become so free that the offensive bonuses to fort assault don't matter, because a win button's still a win button if you win 10% harder, right? And I guess the best way of putting this in a way that's understandable is that, let's say I was putting up a modern battleship to fight a galley, right? The modern battleship is going to defeat the galley. I could give the battleship 10% more guns. It's still going to absolutely obliterate that galley. You'll have better guns, don't get me wrong. You know, it's 10% better battleship, but it's still demolishing the galley. And so, at the moment, sending in like 50k regular infantry to assault any fort in the game, you do just win. So the siege ability doesn't matter. The assault ability doesn't matter. The fort defense, though, sucks, especially if a siege general trying to counter siege, because that means that your forts will fall faster, and the AI doesn't know that the assault button is a free win button. Meaning that I think even on offensive campaigns, just almost universally, you're better off going defensive. You're allowed more forts, your forts are cheaper, and your fort defense goes up. The only argument is that if you're doing some kind of army movement, speed, zoom build, obviously offensive is better. But beyond that, I would genuinely recommend defensive. Better for when you're playing tool, better when you're playing wide base, better for just playing the game. But with that, we move on to naval versus land. These have been rebalanced a ridiculous amount of times, but they have been rebalanced so much that I'm just going to say the worst thing to be for this is in the middle. You want to hard go towards naval for naval proximity or maritime presence, because proximity cost through maritime -1 is huge for trying to push through boats. Maritime presence increase by 30% is just great. Trade range used overseas is nice. Trade range used over land increasing is hurts, but you're trading over the sea. Or going down land is great because trade range used over land is nice. Proximity cost through land -10% is huge. Max RGO size is also a nice thing to have. In essence, both of these are absolutely viable, just depends. Are you a boat empire? Go boat. Are you a land empire? Go land. That's about it. There's not much more to say about it. There's nothing inherently that stands out from one or the other. There was a patch where the land proximity cost for land just didn't work, so naval was better. And there was also a patch where naval was so ridiculously good that there was a... I forgot which person did it specifically, I probably wouldn't mention names, but they had a save as England where they had 70 proximity in the New World. And I'm like, okay, all right. You know, if Navy's so good that we've got 70 proximity on goddamn New York, then maybe this does need a nerf, and it was nerfed, and that was before the game released. Still a funny thing to mention. But the reason I bring all this up is that both naval and land are fully viable. Pick. You want a land empire, go land. You want a naval empire, let's go naval. And with that, we move on to traditional versus capital economy. With capital economy, your building costs are reduced by 10%, your food production is reduced by 20%, that sucks. You have access to cheaper loans, and you have an absolutely ridiculously massive bonus of 20% production efficiency, which is obscene and is ridiculously powerful, and it's kind of the selling point of capital economy. Traditional economy, meanwhile, rejects the idea of having to actually produce things and instead digs them out of the ground. Yeah, your buildings go up by 10%, but remember the raw materials output that I mentioned previously, that's pretty good. Yeah, you get 20% more of it now, and you get 20% more food output. And this kind of double dips because the way that food output actually works if you don't look at subsistence agriculture is, let's take a look at these sturdy grains, right? We produce more sturdy grains because of our RGO raw resource output, and then each sturdy grain we produce gets converted to food, but that conversion to food is then affected by the food and RGO output. In practice, meaning that something like traditional economy with both 20% raw material and 20% food output leads to a, well, double counted 20% multiplied by 20% again output on food. So it's not even a 40% jump, it's a 42% jump, if math serves me correctly. I hope so, because it's multiplied with itself. Population capacity is also worth a mention. The way that population capacity works is every single location has a population cap, and you basically stop growing your population once you hit population cap, and you get a bit more migration, attraction, population growth if you're below the population cap. It's 1837. I'm pop growth maxing. I'm nowhere is hitting population cap. I think this place is my most populated location. Let me double check just in case. Yeah, give or take, right? And it's halfway to pop cap. You're not hitting pop cap, you're fine. Rural areas have a bit less pop cap, and this is my pretty intensive agricultural place with 100k pops here. Now, is this a good or a bad thing? The pop cap thing, I mean, it's nice, but it's just you're not hitting pop cap, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. If you're hitting pop cap, it's a very good problem to have. So an increase to pop cap is really whatever. So yeah, and if we actually take a look at the population growth itself, the fact that you have available free land does cap out at like plus 10%. So what I'm trying to say is that I've heard arguments that traditional economy is good because of the population capacity. My case is shut up because population capacity does nothing. you're pretty much never going to hit PopCap. And if you're hitting PopCap, you're doing so well, you don't care about pretty much any of the modifiers here. Maybe apart from the capital economy ones, because you want production efficiency. But look, even without, if you're a PopCap, you're making enough money from just taxing the people at that population. But okay, traditional economy is just really, really good with RGOs getting things out of the land and not actually producing things. And it's so disgustingly good at such a high level that if you go capital economy too early, you're not going to be in a situation where you can abuse that production efficiency. And as you start to abuse the production efficiency, what's going to happen is okay, I've gone full capital economy, I'm making paper. But there's not a lot of trade early game, there's not a lot of this paper going around, I'm going to crash the price of paper. So paper is going to, if I take a look at its price at the moment, I mean, even here in the Edinburgh market, it's gone down to 1.75 from 2, right? So paper is going to become less profitable. But you have just crashed your RGO output, which means that your output of lumber, of fiber crops, not cloth, because that's a produced good, but your output of fiber crops and lumber, for example, is going to fall, which means that those prices for lumber and fiber crops, they're going to go up, which is going to really hurt your productivity. I mean, there's quite a few cases where if you go down capital economy too passionately, you're going to run out of money. I still think capital economy is very good once you get capital economy going. But because there's relatively few raw material resource output buffs, and because just living off the land can be so profitable, I need to do further testing on this, but I have a sneaking suspicion that you're better off sticking with traditional economy, super scaling your traditional economy to just be filthy rich, and then building inefficient workshops and inefficient paper mills without the 20% production efficiency in the capital economy, that you're able to just like, okay, I have less paper workshops, right? But I can build 20% more of them because I'm so rich from traditional economy. I can build 200% more of them. And so, yeah, each one is less efficient, but I don't care. Of course, for capital economy, the bank interest is still nice, the building cost still helps, and all those things are true. But just don't undervalue the power of sitting on traditional economy for, frankly, a bit too long and sticking with it. And if it's too painful to switch into capital economy, don't fret. The food output buffs and the raw material output are very, very good. I did go down capital economy in this campaign, but again, this was a lot on my end. I will need to do further testing, but I still preliminarily want to conclude, and I may be wrong, so just as a warning, I think traditional economy is just that little bit stronger at the moment than capital economy. And while capital economy remains viable, I think people are way too harsh on the power of traditional economy. If anything, I think nerfing trad economy to encourage a more natural progression that we saw during this time period would make more sense. But with that said, we now move on to individualism versus communalism. I'm going to be upfront here. I think the army morale and navy morale is great for MP because you need army stats, but the estate satisfaction equilibrium from individualism sucks, and the pop migration is you get enough pop migration if you use your estates. I think the passive pop migration is not enough to justify the plus 50% of doing much, and if you're doing active pop migration by telling people to expel from high pop areas, which basically makes the people leave out of them, and then you're doing courage migration to make people arrive at those places faster, you can still do migration maxing despite not having individualism. So the pop migration doesn't matter. The army morale and navy morale matters for MP, otherwise you don't need them in single player. The estate satisfaction algorithm of -5 sucks. I'm doing LARP here, but that's my statement. Communalism, on the other hand, revoke privilege cost of -15% is goddamn amazing. It is literally better than being a fully absolutist monarch with -30%. And of course, it stacks with communalism. So a communalist, absolutist government is ridiculously good at revoking privileges and crown power maxing. And it also has the added privilege of, if you revoke a bunch of privileges from estates, you can redo them and redo your estate privileges at any point. The pub join rebels threshold is nice, but you shouldn't be relied upon. And as opposed to individualism giving a decrease to -5% estate satisfaction equilibrium, you actually gain 2.5 estate satisfaction equilibrium here as well. So that's 2.5% more taxes. That being said, if you're not revoking a lot of privileges and you're just doing this for the estate satisfaction equilibrium, 2.5% isn't really worth it. So my formal recommendation is that if you're in multiplayer or squeezing out army quality for a good army build, go individual. 95% of the other time, you either want to sit in the middle, so not really caring about it, or going towards communalism for the estate satisfaction equilibrium and the revoked privilege cost. That revoked privilege cost gets really, really amazing at 100 communalism. Can confirm, have tried it. This is a LARP game where I've gone individual, but I do think communalism is just better, but because of that revoked privilege cost. If you're not revoking privileges, though, again, sit in the middle. So yeah, to conclude this one, I think communalism or middle is fine. With that though, we move on to outward versus inward. If inward was available from earlier where the crown power kind of mattered, it would be nice. The monthly control is a bit more whatever. Antagonism, language modifiers, whatever. Same for the cultural tradition. I think if you are doing fort maxing and you're trying to do like a Georgia with a hyper defensive fort build, going into an inward traditionalist country that's defensive to do like a funny fort build, sure, that's fine. But is it really worth committing down to inward? Well, by the time you unlock it, the 25% crown power is nice, but again, you're going to have other sources of crown power. Multi-colonial migration means that, okay, you're not going to have migration to colonies, but you could also just not have migration to colonies if you're not colonizing. And as for outward, well, it's nice if you're doing colonization. Your cultural tradition decreases, but whatever. Your power projection's not bad. I think that's about the only thing that's, valued from there. The thing with outward that has to be mentioned is actually, I think outward is good for not a colonialist build. Well, obviously it's good for colonialist build because the multi-colonial migration diplomatic capacity is good. But I actually think outward is the best one for vassal maxing. Because 33% modifier on diplomatic capacity is huge, especially when you take a look at what the diplomatic spending actually does. It gives you extra increase in diplomatic capacity, right? But if you then take a look at your diplomacy, there's a bunch of things that give you base diplomatic capacity. I haven't even researched in this game because I didn't need them. But it does mean that it's one of those few other percentage modifiers on top of your diplomatic spending and your ruler dip ability to just get a lot more diplomatic capacity and have a lot more subjects. And remember, exceeding diplomatic capacity is very bad for your for their loyalty. But as weird as it sounds, if you're vassal max and you want to go outward. Otherwise, if you're not running vassals, you're not colonizing, and you're not doing a fort build, I think it's fine to sit in the middle for this. I don't think it's worth committing that much effort to go either or on this one. I went inward in this love campaign because I was going to go crown power max, but then I've also decided I'm not going to go crown power max, so kind of haven't done anything here. But I think it's fine to not bother with either. The monthly control 0.25 can also be nice to recover control if it falls, but if the control matters that much, they want to recover it, increase control with cabinet, right? That's a better way of doing it. You get like +3 instead of +0.5, so that's something to bear in mind. Overall, though, inward versus outward, happy to sit in the middle. If you're vassal maxing or colonizing, obviously go outward, and if you're fort maxing, go inward. But I think by the time you get inward, the crown power isn't, it looks good, but isn't worth it. So yeah, there you go. That's my summary of that. And then finally, we have, in terms of normals, before we go to the Jurisprudence and the Sinicization ones, we have Absolutism versus Liberalism. I think that EU5 at the moment is very much missing an admin efficiency mechanic, like a similar admin efficiency mechanic that EU4 had for Conquest. And what that means is that Absolutism is very good for small nations that want to be crown power maxing, right? But the problem is that you piss off your estates by 5%, so you hurt taxes. Yeah, your crown power is higher, but great. You don't need the 100% crown power to hit stupid levels of crown power. I've given out every privilege, and I've literally done things like free press, and I favor the ruler, but I've got a free press, I've got direct inheritance of -10 crown power, I've got debuffs to crown power, and I've gone liberalism, and I've given privileges up the wazoo for everyone, and I'm still on 45% crown power, right? You don't need the plus 100% from absolutism to have a lot of crown power. So my next question becomes, is that -5 estate satisfaction equilibrium worth it? And is that enough to stop pobs joining rebels? Probably not. 2.5 pob join rebels threshold is not enough to prevent a lot of people joining your rebellions. So it's good to go down absolutism if you want to revoke a bunch of privileges, sure. It works especially well with communal. Otherwise, I think absolutism is just really underbaked compared to the one overpowered part of liberalism. Parliament request issue support needed -10% means that you need 10% support less in your cabinet to ask for changes, and especially as you change your parliament type to a constitutional parliament, which reduces the support by 25%. Look, trading 15% support for larger levies or law changes or extra taxes for loads of extra money, or again, CBs 15 a pop is ridiculously powerful, and I think that's one of the most overpowered parts about liberalism. It's modifier stack and the parliament request issue support. And the problem with liberalism is that it just keeps getting better. It is just goddamn amazing. The cultural capacity of 20% means that if you actually have a bunch of other cultures, you can accept a lot more and have a lot more cause. Your estates goddamn love it at +5%. And yeah, your pubs join rebels more, but in general, your the states are happier, so you kind of have less rebels, right? If you're not taxing them higher. So for me, I think at the moment, liberalism really is a no-brainer pretty much every time. Simply because you can be an absolutist monarch while also running a liberal society, as ironic as it sounds. Liberalism doesn't decrease your crown power. By the time you actually have liberalism versus absolutism, you have so many other bonuses that give you crown power. You don't really need the 100% from absolutism, just to be clear, right? So yeah, that's my formal recommendation. I still think absolutism for that crown power increases because crown power leads to how much money you make from trade, right? At the moment, that 45% crown power means my trade income share is 45%. That's good if you want to get to like 70% crown power and be a trade republic. But unless you're a very small trade republic, I don't think absolutism makes sense compared to the power of liberalism. So, liberalism all the way. With that, though, we have two more to cover. The next one we're going to be covering is mysticism versus legalism. I mean, mysticism versus jurisprudence. It's definitely jurisprudence, it's not legalism. Shh. The situation, though, with jurisprudence versus mysticism is that you want to go either 100% mysticism or 100% jurisprudence because both give clergy states equilibrium. So you want that. I don't think the 10% pop conversion speed matters as much. I think that's a pretty moot modifier. The 10% army morale can matter, but jurisprudences giving 10% efficiency of cabinet and research progress is so ridiculous, where I actually think that 10% research progress means you get more mil techs, you have access to. You, in essence, get for every 10 techs that you research an extra free technology, 10% more monthly research progress. Not a good comparison because there's going to be a bunch of other monthly research progress modifiers, and it becomes, as you stack, let's say 100% research progress, each individual plus 10% is less impactful. But still, you do get a lot more technologies by having jurisprudence, and you're able to get it from 1337, so you can get it to 100% and keep it there for that 10% research progress, and then it also comes to efficiency of cabinet. I'm genuinely struggling to think of an example of when mysticism is going to be better. I guess inside the individual battles, sure, in MP, sometimes you want the army morale. But to be honest, I think even in MP, I'd rather sack the 10% army morale to have more technologies and more efficiency of cabinet. I'm sorry. It's a very, sad thing that there's so little nuance to talk about, but yeah, I just think jurisprudence at the moment is stronger. Finally, for sinicization versus unsinicization, I'll be honest, sinicization is just pretty strong. 25% legislative efficiency is a very strong modifier to have. Getting more Middle Kingdom tribute received is very nice because it means basically, if you take a look at your economy tab, you are getting the tribute system. The way it works is more meant to represent the tribute was more like trade, where people would give tribute, but then they would actually make money because they would get gifts back from China. So in essence, the tributary system actually ends up as being profitable, and you get more money from said tribute system. And in this case, if you look here in Korea, this tribute system is currently like more than half of our economy. It's ridiculous. Now, it's not a fair comparison. We're not really minting, and I would up taxes more and get a lot of other modifiers. Shouldn't be taxing tribes, let's be honest. Look at that. Taxing tribes is nothing. So, not a ultimately fair comparison. I haven't done any other country setup, so on and so forth. I'm sure I can get this economy to look a lot better. But still, it's a very non-trivial part of your income, these tribute payments, right? So that's pretty strong if you're, an actual tributary. You pick up more trade capacity, you pick up research progress, legislative efficiency, and you lose cultural tradition. The cultural tradition hurts if you're trying to do a defensive fort build. Otherwise, it really doesn't matter. And for unsinicization, there's a lot that you have to give up, but in some very specific cases, the prestige decay, if you want to be prestige maxing, is nice, in essence telling China to go screw off. The big one is that minus 33% stab investment cost works very well with traditional unsinicized. You're going to hurt on techs, because you're going to be missing out on the innovative max literacy, and you're going to be missing out on the research speed from sinicization. So you're going to hurt your science, but I will have to concede minus 53% stab investment cost is a pretty good baseline if you're trying to stack stab investment cost. However, if you're not trying to get a lot of prestige and you're not trying to get stab investment cost down, I do think sinicization is better. So to be clear, basically 95% of games where you have access to sinicization, you should sinicize yourself. But to recap, I do formally recommend sinicization, jurisprudence, centralization, innovativeness, and it depends between spiritual or humanist, tall go spiritualist, wide go humanist, aristocratic, serfdom, either a middle of the pack, mercantilist if you're trying to protect all your trade and own the trade, and free trade if you don't want to own the people you're trading, conciliatory unless you're giga modifier stacking war score cost for belligerent, so 95% of the time go conciliatory, quantity, defensive. Land or navy, pick one and go all in on either. Capital economy is strong, but I'd recommend being very careful when you go away from traditional economy, and feel free to stick around a traditional economy for longer than you feel like you should. And finally, of course, communalism. Technically inward, but more probably outward if you're playing with subjects or colonies. And finally, liberalism. Those are my formal recommendations to recap. But with that said, there's unfortunately all the time I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. A special thank you to all my channel members, especially Ark, Solar, Lemon, Lozendica, Nick Huss, Nanhatan, Star72, The Awesome Rabbit, Best for Gaming, Gramble Flavia, Lebarule, W Haste, Sov, Anthony35, AC Napa, Conspiracy Pizza, Yukata, Downray, Marby, Jack, Ryland, Stuart Allen, Andrew Black, Nebula, Zentronic, Twinet, and Aquabird.